My name is Dave. I am a digital strategist. I also do some content work kind of on the side. I do some writing, I do some content strategy here and there. That's kind of, I guess, my side hustle. This talks about telling stories, so I thought it would be appropriate to kind of start with one. I was in grade 10 and I was taking computer science, and I'm going to age myself a little bit, but we were learning Turbo Pascal and HyperCard. And I wrote a program that had what we would today probably call a conversational interface. It used personal pronouns and asked people questions. It said I, it said you, that sort of thing. And when my teacher, Mr. Vogt, who I will say in his defense is probably one of the greatest teachers I ever had, but when he reviewed the program I wrote, he warned me that it makes people uncomfortable when computers act like they are humans. So, now, this is not something I had ever really thought about before. That the way I wrote a program, the way I wrote some code, the way I designed an interaction, I didn't think of it as designing back then. But I never thought that this could have an impact on the way that a person using the program would feel, what they thought. So it was probably, looking back in retrospect, the first conversation I ever had about user experience. And I want to share that because sometimes when I come out to these kinds of events, I feel a little bit like an imposter, because I'm not trained as a designer. And while I know some HTML, some CSS, and I've tried to make web apps before, they're very buggy. I would definitely not consider myself a coder by any means. My background is actually in English literature. When I left high school, I was debating between doing English and doing computer science, and English had less math. So that's what I went to study. And I stuck with it for a long time, and I eventually did a master's and a PhD in English. And when I tell people this, they're often kind of surprised, because now, I'm a digital strategist, and I'm like, well, how did you end up in that kind of a world? But really working in UX as I do feels a little bit like I'm coming full circle. Because in many ways, I've kind of been thinking about websites and the internet for 20 years now, off and on. So if the picture of my son originally didn't elicit your sympathy, this website should. This is a website I made in 10th grade, circa 1996. I know it's not the first one I ever made, because it has a sidebar, and the sidebar does not use frames. And I know there's a frames version of this before that. It's a bit cringy today. I don't know how I thought anybody could possibly read the dark blue on black text down there. But I've been thinking for a long time about how websites are mechanisms for sharing information, for educating people, for helping people solve problems, even if nobody ever showed up at 7 p.m. for base chat. At any rate, this is all to say that my perspective on UX is heavily informed by the fact that the bulk of my training isn't in design. It's not in software development or front-end development. So much of it is in stories. Thinking about how stories work, thinking about how we tell stories effectively, about how people consume those stories, about how they interpret those stories. And so what I'm hoping to do today is share with you a bit of that perspective that I have, in hopes that maybe you'll think a little bit more about the stories that you guys are telling to the people you're designing for, and about the people you're designing for. When you're interacting with them, when you're building websites, when you're building apps, and creating code. So my talk today kind of has 3 sections. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about what I mean when I talk about storytelling, and why it's so powerful. And I'm going to clear up a few of the terms that I'm going to be using that maybe get thrown around interchangeably, but I want to add a little bit of a nuance to that. So things like storytelling and also narrative, which I'm going to talk about a fair bit. The second thing I want to talk about is what stories are we telling about our users? And think about what our responsibilities are as strategists, as researchers, as UX architects and UX designers when we're talking about our users and creating narratives about them. And third, I want to look at how the way we talk about our users translates into the stories we tell to our users, and maybe offer some suggestions about how we can tell better stories. I'm a little self-conscious about this talk because one of the great things about Ladies at UX event is you often come back with a lot of like practical advice, and you're like, I'm ready to put this into practice when I go into work the next morning. I'm probably going to ask more questions and answers. It's probably a byproduct of my academic background. So I'll ask lots of questions, maybe confuse you a bit, but hopefully it'll be a little entertaining in the end of it. So stories. I think on one hand, stories in UX might seem like a bit of an odd mix sometimes. In fact, there are often cases when I think we're suspicious of storytelling. Sometimes it feels a little bit more like, well, that's what marketing does, right? So we create these pages, and they come and they put their spin on things to try to convince people to buy the products and all that kind of thing. And you know, as UXers, we like to think, well, we're here to solve problems. You know, we're here to help people out. But at the same time, if we want to talk about ourselves as UXers as being really empathetic to our users, as being really human-centric designers and creators, I think that means understanding a bit, at least, about what story is and how it works. Because as human beings, we really are wired for stories. London lifers may recognize this graphic, but at any rate, stories, as it turns out, are remarkably effective at communicating a lot of information that can be difficult to communicate otherwise. We don't think as humans in facts, we think in terms of stories. And so I'm going to borrow some neuroscience here, and with the caveat that this is not something I actually have a lot of expertise in, so if there are any neuroscientists here, I apologize in advance. I don't know if I understand all of the, the detail of all of this, but I think I understand this much. It's that if you present somebody with a basic list of facts, you just data points and discrete pieces of information, they process it with sort of two parts of their brain. And these are the parts of the brain that are associated with just processing language, so translating the words I'm saying into some sort of meaning. But when we're told a story, when we consume a story, when we hear a story, other parts of our brain start to light up too. Those that are associated with sensory processing. So when we hear a story, our brain reacts as though it is actually experiencing the sensations that are being described in the story. So if you're reading a story and it's talking about, I don't know, the smell of coffee or something like that, the same parts of your brain that would react when you really smell coffee react when you're reading the story as well. So the brain, it turns out, doesn't actually distinguish all that much between reading about an experience and encountering the experience in real life. And because of this, stories convey so much more information than just a basic list of facts. Color, action, characters, sights, smells, sounds, and emotions. Stories are extremely information dense. Keith Oatley, who's a professor of cognitive psychology at U of T, says, reading is a simulation of reality that runs on minds of readers just as computer simulations run on computers. So hearing a story literally creates augmented reality, no technology required. And stories help us make stronger connections with other individuals as well. So like a meta-analysis of 86 MRI studies showed that there's a substantial overlap between the brain networks used to understand stories and those that are used to navigate interactions with other individuals. Stories help us cultivate trust as well. So I believe that, unless the internet's lying to me, that this represents oxytocin, which is also known as the love hormone. I'm not a chemist either. Also known as the love hormone. It's a chemical in our brain that's very strongly linked with trust. And oxytocin gets released by our brain when there's physical contact between two individuals, such as a hug. Which is why if you've had a baby, they always want to encourage skin-to-skin contact between the baby and the parents immediately, especially with the mother, because it creates such a deep bond between the parents and the child. And oxytocin is also released when we experience an act of kindness and if we listen to emotional stories. So it's really quite remarkable. And I think this is worth thinking about because as UXers, one of sort of our core tenets of belief is that user experience should encompass the entirety of the user's response to an interaction. It's the total experience. It's not just, is it usable? It's not just, is it convenient or efficient? but it's the entirety of that response, including the emotional response that people have to an experience. And stories are such a big part of that. So, what is a story? When I see or hear people talking about stories, you usually see some version of this diagram. It's a pretty common basic story structure. It's kind of a variation, if you want to be technical, on Freytag's pyramid. You have a character or a protagonist, or we could say a user, who has some kind of a problem. They realize that they have a problem and they commit to solving it. And they encounter struggles on the way to solving their problem. And in the story, the tension rises until they reach a crisis point and a climax. And throughout this, the character undergoes some kind of a transformation. And the climax is the moment that seals the transformation. The character is no longer who they were before. They have a new perspective brought about through their struggles, and then, depending on the story, the status quo might be restored, or else a new order might be established. Now, we see this a lot, but the thing is if telling stories was really just as simple as that, everybody and their dog would have a novel out right now. It's not quite that simple. This is only part of the story, so to speak, because the way we tell that story is just as, if not more, important. So I'm going to ask you to indulge me. The people I've worked with know I have an inordinate fondness for a book called Moby Dick. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Moby Dick, not too long, I promise. But to illustrate the point, I wanted to pick a story that I've spent a lot of my life thinking about. And the truth is that this talk actually originated from a conversation I had with Brian Frank. And I told him I wanted to one day write something that was about the user experience of Moby Dick. And he said that was a great idea. And that has kind of turned into this talk. So thanks, Brian, for that. I told him before, if it goes well, he gets some credit. If it goes poorly, he gets the blame. So I'm covered either way. But this is that conversation, sort of vestigial tale. But if you're not familiar with Moby Dick, the basics of the plot are really quite simple, right? There's a guy, call him Ishmael, who is feeling kind of out of sorts, so he decides to go see what he says is the watery part of the world. He goes to sea, and he gets a job on board a whaling ship. And it turns out that the captain of that ship, a guy named Ahab, is a little bit crazy and happens to be obsessed with hunting one whale in particular, a white whale called Moby Dick. Because, you see, Moby Dick took his leg years ago, and now Ahab wants revenge. So the story is Ahab and the crew of his ship, the Pequod, chasing this whale all around the world. Eventually they find him, they chase him for 3 days, but, spoiler alert, Moby Dick destroys the whole ship and Ishmael is the only survivor. That's the Ron Swanson version of the story, and I apologize if this is quiet. But sorry, it's not getting any louder than that. What Ron's saying is that his favorite book is Moby Dick because there's no frou-frou symbolism. It's just a nice, simple story about a man who hates an animal. But he says, does Moby Dick symbolize, the ultimate emptiness of life? No, it's just a bleeping fish. That's the Ron Swanson version of the story. Really simple, right? So, if that's what the story is about, if Ron's right, how are people like me able to spend literally years of their life studying this book and trying to get other meanings out of it and interpreting it? It's not the plot of the story that we care about at all. The plot's really simple. It's really about the narrative. Has anybody here actually read Moby Dick besides? Yay! Has anybody started reading it and then thrown it across the room?
Yeah.
Fair enough. I understand. If you've read it, or even if you've gotten really pissed off with it, you'll know that the book's, it's really weird. And Herman Melville, the author, tells the story in kind of a weird way. It starts out seeming like it's going to be a book about a guy who goes off to sea and hunts whales. But then there are chapters and chapters and chapters and chapters devoted to just descriptions of whales and chapters about what does the whale mean. There's a whole chapter called The Whiteness of the Whale. That's just about the color white. Like, designers should love that. But you'll know there's like chapters that are occasionally written like a stage play instead of a novel. There's a section in the middle that is a story about a completely different ship that's told in flashback by Ishmael after the events of the original story. And what the relationship is, who knows? You mean, you can read my dissertation and see what I think, but don't read my dissertation because that's even more boring than Moby Dick probably. But it's really weird, right? But the thing is that it's that narrative, the way the story gets told, and that's where the meaning really comes from. It's how the story gets told that gives us the meaning of the whole thing. Without all that narrative, the story is just a bunch of events. The narrative, though, is what helps us figure out how we relate those events to one another. So the form of the story is just as important as the events that are being narrated, because these things all come together to build one big meaning, one big impression that we get from the story. But the thing is, this isn't just something that happens in fiction, because we are constantly doing this ourselves. We are constantly trying to find meaning between perhaps totally coincidental events, totally unrelated events, but we want them to be related, right? So things that'll happen and we think that they should be related, we can't unpack why, we'll start to make it up. This is how you get like conspiracy theories and stuff. If there's something I don't understand, so I'm just going to make it up and then tell myself a nice story about how it occurred. As human beings, we need that kind of narrative. Now, the narrative you might be searching for right now is, well, what the heck does all this actually have to do with UX? The thing is that narrative is extremely powerful. And whether we do it mindfully or not, we're always already creating narratives. So what I want to say is that we have a responsibility to be mindful of the narratives that we are telling. That we tell to each other, that we tell to our stakeholders, that we tell to our colleagues, and that we tell to our users. So I want to start now by thinking a little bit about the narratives that we tell each other about our users. One of the things that we're always striving to do, one of the things we're always striving to do as UXers is build a really good understanding of users. We want to know them really well, we want to understand them, we want to know their problems, we want to fall in love with our users and the challenges that they present us with. And in an effort to do this over the years, we built up quite a few ways to do that. And we use them over and over again. You could think of them, if we're going to keep up this already belabored book metaphor, you could call them genres of user information that we use to communicate with one another about our users. So one of the things I want us to sort of think about, I want to ask about, is how these tools that we make to talk about our users are creating narratives about our users and what they do. So to start with one that we're probably all very familiar with is the persona. And I'm sure we've all had experiences dealing with good personas and dealing with awful personas. But at the end of the day, what is a persona but a story? A persona well done is really about communicating some of the research that has happened, some of the research that we've done into a more accessible format. It translates pages of qualitative and quantitative research that have been done through interviews, contextual inquiries, observations, surveys, and creates something that can be easily shared and understood. But if we start to think of this about this as a narrative, we can start to think about the story that the persona is actually telling. Because when we create a persona, we are making narrative decisions all the time. We are determining what gets into the story we are going to share about our users, and what gets it left out. So if you're creating personas, and say you go and interview 10 different users and turn that into one persona, you're making choices about whose experience gets included and whose experience gets left on the margins. So you're making choices about whose experience you value, whose experience you think is more important. And that's a lot of responsibility, and I don't think it's a responsibility that we should take lightly, because we're making choices about who and what we care about as designers. We're thinking about, making choices about the range of and the diversity of the experiences that we are going to support. And the way we present our personas are narratives too. So what other stories does a persona tell? What about the format itself? What's the difference between a big glossy persona that gets posted up on the wall? I don't know where this is, but I thought it was incredible that this company is confident enough in its personas that they put up what seems like a pretty permanent display of 4 personas or so up on the wall. But what does that say about what they think about their personas? It suggests to me anyway that, well, they think these things are pretty static. They're not going anywhere. They think that their personas, they have a lot of confidence in their personas, I hope. Otherwise, that was probably a pretty costly mistake to make. But then on the other side of the picture, you have, and I know that's not technically a persona, but it's another representation of the user. But instead of being this big, glossy, formatted image that gets posted up on the wall and the people are all going to look in as they come into the office every day, it's Post-it notes, things that get moved around, things that get interacted with, which to me suggests a lot more than this is an image of the user that is in flux, that is moving, that is changing, that we are going to make alterations to. And then think a little bit further. So what if you're presenting to a stakeholder or presenting to a client and you walk them in and you say, these are the personas for the project, and you show them these big glossy pictures on the wall, versus these are the personas we're working on for the project. Which one of these narratives is going to invite more interactivity? Which is going to invite more collaboration? And I'm not, it might be sounding like I'm trying to, dismiss the one on the left in favor of the one on the right, which isn't the case at all. But the point is that you need to be mindful of what each one does and how the way you communicate about your users and your personas tell a story in their own right. And you can add scenarios to your personas too, right? What does adding a scenario to your persona do that just presenting a static persona does not? They may give your personas life, might give them action, might give them intent. Jared Spool says that scenarios help define why the persona is important. They take something that's static and make it more active, providing deeper context, and deeper understanding of who the users are, of the range of their experience and the range of their needs. And so if you can add a scenario to it, it puts the personas in motion, turns them into being from static portraits into dynamic, living, breathing characters. But then again, you then have to make choices about, well, which of the scenarios we're going to talk about, which of the scenarios that we care about. Alternatively, we might create user stories. Each is a little brief narrative about a character who has a desire or a conflict. And the essence of story is in conflict. You don't have a story if there's not something that somebody wants and they can't get. And you have to tell a story about how they're going to get it. And that's what a user story does. But you can think too, well, if I'm writing a user story, is that telling a different story than if I wrote a job to be done? Versus a requirements document, versus a, just a list of features. What gets included and what gets left out of this narrative? Or we can expand to something even bigger. So this is an example, of course, of an experience map that is meant to show the totality of a user's encounter with some sort of space or some sort of concept or some facet of the world. And is this story different from one we might tell if we called it a customer journey? What does it mean if we say an experience map versus a customer journey? What is that saying about our relationship to the person we're trying to describe here? What does these imply about the human being whose story we are narrating to each other? And I'm asking a lot of questions here because there's not a single right answer to any of these questions that I can give you. I'm not going to tell you, well, this is the right way to do it to make sure you've captured the entirety of your user's experience and you can do this all right. These are all powerful tools. These are all useful tools for helping us to communicate with one another about, in ways that make data more meaningful, more apprehendable, that help build empathy around the real lived experiences of the people that we're trying to help through the interactions we're designing. But what I am saying is that we need to be mindful of how we're communicating. And the narrative that we use to do that is a big part of the meaning. And so when we're creating deliverables or artifacts to do with our design process, we want to think really hard about, well, what are the choices I am making? What am I choosing to include? What am I choosing to exclude from this story? Because all that filters in to the other side of this, which is how do all of those narratives that we have created about our users translate into the stories we tell to our users? Because once again, I think when we hear storytelling, we go back to that old plot diagram, right? And we're a little bit leery of that maybe, because we think of all that story stuff as things that get in people's way. I think that often when we create user experiences, at least when it comes to stuff like websites, which is what I work on most of the time, we're content to be like Ron, right? We don't want a lot of that to use his frou-frou accoutrements around the experience that we're building. And we're often, we're trained and taught to focus narrowly on the user's top task. What is the user's goal? And anything gets in the way of that goal is clutter. It gets in the user's way. It's bad UX. And that's a narrative that we tell ourselves too. It's a narrative we tell ourselves about our users and what's important to them. But that has a profound impact on the experience that we're going to create for them. So a lot of the time we start to see a little bit of a line drawn, I think, between UX and content. So we have UXers who are designing the experience in terms of like boxes and arrows, and wireframes and that kind of stuff. And then another team is sort of responsible for filling it out. But to me, this is a little bit of a risk because it assumes separation between the form and the content. And as I've been trying to say tonight, the way the user gets meaning out of that experience isn't necessarily going to separate those things. They need to be working together to create one holistic meaning. And then on the content side of things, we often fall back in the good old inverted pyramid. And if you haven't encountered this before, it's a basic structure endorsed by Nielsen Norman Group, so you know it's good, that the most important information goes at the top of the page, and then as you get further down the page, less important information, less important information, less important information. Need to know down to nice to know. And to be honest, this makes a ton of sense. I agree with this. I endorse the inverted pyramid structure in many, many cases. The most important information comes first because, as we're told over and over again, people don't read on the internet and they skim, and this structure helps facilitate reading comprehension. Totally true. I'm not disagreeing with Don Norman. I would never do that. He knows a lot more than I do. So I'm not saying that this is bad or anything. A lot of the time, this is exactly the right narrative structure for the job. If I hit a website and I know what I want, I just want to get it, right? If I want the phone number, or I want a menu, or I want to be able to complete some transaction, it's really annoying when all this other stuff's in the way. But what if I don't know what I want? Is this always the best way? Is that inverted pyramid structure the most human-centric way? Are we making assumptions about what is actually important? What if what the user wants and what the user really needs are different things? Is it really the best user experience? I want to tell another story now. I work for an insurance company most of the time in London Life, and one of the products we sell is, of course, life insurance. This is a product that invites people to think about death. We're asking people to contemplate the fact that, yes, you too one day will die, memento mori. Maybe you should be protected for that in case that happens. It's good advice. We have a lot of research that tells us that people usually start shopping for life insurance after experiencing a transformative life event. Usually it's the birth of a child. I don't need research to tell me that, because the first time I thought about life insurance was in 2012. And I know this because I experienced one of the greatest moments of my life. I remember it in my mind's eye. I was sitting on our couch in our little house we were renting in Worthy Village. I was watching The West Wing. Bartlett was doing something awesome that I'm really nostalgic for these days. And my wife came down the stairs and said, "I'm pregnant." Amazing, awesome moment. I don't think to that point in my life I had ever been happier than that moment. Probably terrified too. I probably should have bought the life insurance that day. Because the other moment in which people start to shop for life insurance is a close brush with death. And I don't need research to tell me that either, because less than 3 months after that, I was in a doctor's office having a stranger in a white coat telling me I had cancer. I'm okay now. Obviously, 6 weeks later, I'm still here. But for a brief period of time, I had to think about the possibility of leaving behind a family, a young family, with nothing but my student debt. That's pretty scary. So let me ask you this, what's my top task? What's my job to be done in that situation? It's not get a quote. I stole this from a competitor's site, by the way. What I'm trying to say is that when you reduce, I meant to stop the animations on that, it's distracting, sorry. When you reduce the narrative about your user down to being about a person who always has a clear, specific goal in mind, you might be missing out on some of your users' most important needs. It's a dangerous assumption, I think, because it implies that there's a specific, rational objective that the user is always aiming for. That's a narrative we're telling ourselves. But to paraphrase Andrew Hinton, and I'll confess, I rewrote a whole bunch of this after seeing him talk at CanUX a few weeks back, because he's amazing. But to paraphrase him, to quote him, users are not meat machines. They're not robots who are following a set of instructions, processing inputs, and producing outputs. Human experience is messier. It's way more organic than that. Definitely less predictable. We are emotional creatures. Our decision making is fueled by emotions. When we make a decision, we make it emotionally first with our lizard brains, or whatever you want to call it. And then we rationalize it after the fact. We make the decision, and then we try to logic our way into it. We don't start with logic. And that's not a narrative that I think often we're super comfortable with in UX, because it's a lot harder to deal with, to be honest. But when we create websites that pretend otherwise, I think we're, again, creating another narrative about our relationship to our customers. So when I Google life insurance, and the top result has a page with a bunch of these boxes on it, that is telling me a story. It's giving me a narrative about exactly what I mean to the company who created this page, and frankly to the designer who created this page and whoever signed off on the designs. That they're okay with me being treated strictly as a consumer, as a wallet that they're trying to get a share of. And so I think a lot of the time, we try to go too quickly from that inciting incident at the start of the story to the resolution. Again, sometimes that's the right move. I try not to speak in absolutes, because sometimes that is exactly what your user wants and needs, and that's beautiful. But I think it's dangerous to assume that it's always the right move. Because sometimes the narrative that your user needs is in that messy middle. Sometimes that's where the most important information is, whether your user realizes it yet or not. And sometimes the fastest route from A to B is not the best route. So what can we do about it? I don't know if I have any concrete answers for you, and I apologize for that. And to be quite frank, this is going to get a lot harder before it gets any easier, because we're losing a lot of control over our content. We're losing a lot of control over the stuff we produce. More and more we're seeing that, the forming content, we can't make a lot of assumptions about what it looks like either. We can no longer assume a specific screen size. And I think we've kind of digested that, and we've got responsive design in our back pocket, so great. But we also now can't assume that somebody's going to encounter our content on our website. Maybe they're going to see it as the 0 result on Google. We would love that, wouldn't we? Because they see our content first. But it means we don't have any control over the way it looks. And that's a little scary. Their content might be narrated to us through a chatbot that pops up at the bottom of their screen, like my friend at the beginning of the presentation. It might come through a voice interface. It might be Alexa. presenting our content, presenting our stories to them. It might be pulled into another experience entirely that we can't even imagine today because things change so freaking fast. So I'm afraid I don't have any solid, concrete answers, but I don't want to leave you with nothing. So I have 3 tips that I hope you can take away and apply, or at least think about as you do your design and your UX work. The most important one, I think, is to be mindful. Be mindful of the stories you're telling. Whether it's when you're creating a persona, whether it's when you're making a wireframe, whether it's when you're selecting the imagery you're going to use in your hero banner. Be mindful of the story that you're telling, be mindful of the story you're communicating, and think about how people might interpret it. Second of all, work together. Keep in mind that your users don't see your work as being the product of separate teams or separate individuals. They experience it as one holistic totality. And the sooner you start creating that way, the sooner you start the collaboration and crossing the silos to other teams, the better. So get lots of opinions. Get diverse opinions. Listen to them, respect them, consider them. Consider that your way is not always going to be the only way. You might be wrong, and that's totally okay. Disagreement is good. Disagreement is productive. And finally, question the assumptions. Our field has a lot of different activities, a lot of different deliverables, a lot of different outputs that we sort of create by rote now. And the more professionalized we get, the more that's going to happen. Things that we accept as true without really questioning them because that's the way we were taught. That's what we get asked for by our managers, by our stakeholders, by other people on our team. But never stop asking why, even if you're only asking yourself. Never stop digging deeper. Never assume that just because it's the way things have always been done means it's the right way or the best way. Always put your user first. Actually, don't put your user first. Put the human you're designing for first. Thank you. That's Kate Beaton.
Does anybody have questions?
Amen.
I was just wondering, because you're talking about the A to B, and that is what we're always talking about. Do you know if there's any research into making tasks difficult to make accomplishment more rewarding?
I don't know off the top of my head.
It's sort of like weird but interesting.
Like the feeling that you earned it.
Yeah.
I know like there's the IKEA effect, right? Which is that if you build the furniture, you feel a stronger attachment to it.
Right.
So there's maybe something in that. I don't know if that's ever been applied. User research or not. Brian would probably know better than me, if anybody does. But I do think there's something value in slowing down. I think that's really the point. It's not necessarily that they have to work for it, but sometimes going fast is not always the best thing to do. Sometimes you do need to slow down. There's in content strategy, I've seen a lot lately, a distinction between like fast content and slow content. And so fast content is the content that is that really transactional stuff, like I need a phone number, I don't want to wade through a lot of stuff, versus slow content, which is usually longer form, usually more narrative, usually a bit more of a time commitment, but ultimately more rewarding. And the transactional content is important, but even on like the marketing side where they're KPI focused, they are seeing often a higher ROI on the slow content because of the rewards it gives the reader in terms of the engagement and the story that they're able to hear and tell. So I don't know if that's direct fit with what you're talking about, but I think there's, I suspect, probably.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. One of the things I thought when you mentioned, well, talking about stories, I wondered if the reason we think people don't read on the internet is that we're not actually designing for long content well. Maybe if it's presented.
My response when people say, when they say people don't read on the internet, there are no children here, so people don't read shit on the internet. If I do believe that content is good and it's engaging and it's rewarding the person who's reading it, people will read it. But often that's not the case, and I don't think there's anybody to blame for that. But I do think being more designful about it and thinking about the content experience, and I try to talk about content as a product as well, and it deserves a product life cycle as well. A piece of content is a product that can be improved, that can be iterated on, that you can get people's reactions to, and iterate on quite quickly. So I think we can treat it that way too. So that's my thing. Was like people learning bad content.
Questions? All right, one more round of applause for